Hello, everyone. I thought I would review the book The Well Beloved by Thomas Hardy. And of course, if you enjoy books by Thomas Hardy, you might enjoy my book, The Ecstasy and the Ignominy, or any of my other books, which are written in a very similar style. And of course, this is the first video that I've done where I'm actually using a microphone, not just my phone speaker, because I thought about trying to improve the sound quality. Of course, this actually clips onto my shirt, but I haven't quite figured that out yet. I'll learn it later. But today I just wanted to make the video. Um, now, The Well Beloved is a book by Thomas Hardy. It's the first book actually that I've read by Thomas Hardy, and essentially, um, it is about a character named Jocelyn, I believe. I may be pronouncing that name wrong. You know, so very often when you read books, there are character names you may be saying wrong because you haven't actually heard them spoken aloud. That's probably one of the few benefits I think of audiobooks is that you're not going to mispronounce things in the same way, unless the narrator is also mispronouncing them. Um, but um, but anyway, and he's an artist, a sculptor, but he's obsessed with this idea of the well beloved, which is essentially a spirit, a female spirit who travels from woman to woman, and when she's in a woman, she essentially represents the female ideal. But then, as soon as that woman does something that he doesn't like, something that annoys him, irritates him, um, the spirit then leaves and goes somewhere else. Now, of course, I believe that the well beloved is a metaphorical representation, not um, not a literal spirit for a man searching for the ideal woman, that is his well beloved, and that but no woman can actually match the ideal that he has in his head, and therefore he keeps searching for her. Now, I will say that this book has a very masculine, or it has a very male point of view. And one of the things that I found rather strange when I was looking for video reviews to prepare for this review is that I couldn't really find any by male readers, because I do think that of the female reviews, that many of them didn't really seem to understand Jocelyn or his point of view. And I think that's because the book has a male point of view. I can understand how it would why it would be difficult for a female reader to empathize with Jocelyn or understand his point of view. And because I found that many of them simply did not understand. Now, I will say that many of his actions are not excusable, but as a man, I can understand them. But I think that for female readers, it may be harder to understand his actions or where he's coming from. But essentially he tries to search for the ideal woman, and he just cannot find her. And the the book focuses on three different stages in his life. The first stage is when he's 20, and I will say that at the beginning, I found his character to be very relatable. At the beginning, later not so much. But the idea of a man searching for his the ideal beauty in another woman, and the idea and the ideal character in another woman, those are things that I can actually relate to myself. The idea of finding someone who is just right, just perfect for you, who completes you in every way, and how that can lead to over romanticization. That's something that I can relate to, and because I think, and I think Joffman has this fear as well. Well, excuse me. What if he ends up with someone who isn't really the well beloved, and he regrets it for the rest of his life, and now he has to live with it. And so I can understand that point of view, even though it can lead to people becoming too picky and ultimately and perhaps missing out on relationships that they would have enjoyed, and that's something that ultimately happens to Jocelyn many times. Um, but anyway, um, what happens is that at the beginning he falls in love with this woman named Avice, who is around his age, maybe a little younger, and he's going to marry her. But then she does something. Again, he lives on this island where this peninsula island, or it's more of a peninsula, but sometimes it's an island when the water rises. Um, and the ways there are very are somewhat primitive. They're cut off. There's a lot of interbreeding because there aren't a lot of people living there. But he falls in love with a Vice who has a crush on him. And I will say the descriptions of the island are probably the best part of the book. Um, the poetry there, I believe, is very strong. There's a lot of strong atmosphere there, a lot of vivid atmosphere. But anyway, but then when she doesn't come visit him one day because she's worried about impropriety and how it would seem, he decides that he does not love her anymore. And then he ends up dating this other woman who also leaves him. And so eventually, the book skips time 20 years later, and when now he's 40. He was 20 before. And during this time, he's been searching for the well beloved, but in vain, never finding it in any other woman. But then he finds that Evice is dead, and now there's a second Evice, her daughter, who's 20. And this is where I will say that I start to actually not relate to Jocelyn, because then he falls in love with the daughter because he feels regretful that he rejected the first Evice, and he thinks the daughter looks like um, her mother. And I will say I can't really relate to this. If anything, I've always preferred women who are older than I, not women who are younger. And now maybe when I'm older, I'll change my perspective on that. Especially since as I grow older, it's getting harder and harder to tell the different ages of people apart. Sometimes there's a woman who's 25, but she looks 35. But I will say, in general, I prefer older women, even though in some cases I have been attracted to younger ones. But that's not my preference. But anyway, what happens though is that he tries to form a relationship with her, and for a time that they're together, she comes and stays at his house, not as a romantic partner, but as his maid cleaning. But then he finds out that she is already married, so then he has to end the relationship with her. So then another period of time skips. Now he's 60. He's still single, but now he gets a letter from Evice the second that her husband has died and she wants to see him. And I thought, okay, well, now that her husband has died, maybe they can finally be together. That would be a poignant ending to the book. No, that's not what happens. Instead, he falls in love with Evice the third, which is the granddaughter of the woman from the beginning. And now she's 20 and he's 60. So now he goes after her. And I thought, why'd you have to do that? You could have just gone with the second, which turned out later probably wouldn't have been the best idea either because the mother was ill. But you could have gone with her. But now, because it seems to be he over and over again, Jocelyn rejects legitimate relationships that would make him happy to pursue some kind of ideal that can ultimately end in tragedy, because the mother actually wants her daughter to marry Jocelyn because he's has a fortune and he could provide for her. But then the daughter ends up running off with the stepson of the woman who at the beginning he ran away with and left Evice for, the first Evice. And then but the shock to Evice the second is so great that she ultimately passes as well. And at this point, Jocelyn is so disillusioned that he ultimately doesn't know what to do, and he completely just loses all interest in art. He's completely disillusioned. He he's disillusioned by the idea of the well beloved, and he no longer sees beauty in anything. Quite a tragedy actually. And then he ends up ultimately finding somewhat of a comfort in the woman, in the stepmother of the man who stole the third Evice away, who he had known at the beginning, that who he had ran away with at the beginning of the book, and where she ends up taking care of and providing comfort for him. And she ultimately has many of the same issues that he does, but in a different way, of her trying to appear younger and more beautiful, of her placing her self-worth in beauty. But then ultimately she realizes that that's just a pretension, and she decides to actually look her age, just as he decides that the well beloved is just a romantic ideal that doesn't actually exist. So then ultimately they marry and they end up finding comfort in each other, even though there really isn't still a legitimate love there. But I think the book is essentially about reject is to not get so caught up in a romantic ideal that you lose perspective on the love that's all around you, because that can ultimately lead to a lot of tragedy and a lot of heartbreak. And to me, that is the tragedy and lesson of the well beloved.